although by tomorrow night you've already done a little over half the work.
Okay. This isn't tomorrow night's thing, right?
No, this isn't tomorrow night's thing. No, this is just the overall general paper that we're working on, right?
Okay.
So, as I was saying to the other two before you got here, essentially what we're trying to do is write the paper in small stages to make the whole thing a little bit less stressful, and so that you get feedback on each step, right? So for tomorrow night, right, remember I've given you a little extra time with this. Make sure you complete assignment 5 on page 177. You're going to revise reflection 1 and use that as your starting point. And you're aiming for about 1,000 words, right? So revise reflection 1 and then add to it. Now, Tuesday, I want to remind everybody, too, not to come here, right? Remember, room 113, bottom floor, front of the building. The door will be open. Look for me there. And remember to bring stuff to work on your draft, right? So essentially, you'll have a chance to work in the computer lab and ask me to look at things as you're working, right? And then Thursday, we have individual conferences. I know at least one of you has already signed up. So yeah, we won't be physically meeting in this classroom on Thursday. Actually, we won't be coming to this classroom at all next week.
Where do we sign up for the individual conference?
I sent an email with a Google Doc this morning.
Oh, I gotta look at that. Okay.
Yeah, so yeah, that should be waiting in your email. All right, so let's talk about the assignment sheet that I've just given you. So paper 1 is overall going to be about 1,500 words. And it's going to be a close reading of a single text, right? The close reading that you are already in the process of doing. So I just want to quickly note, as usual, the formal requirements here, right? Everybody's more or less following these directions, but just to be sure, like Times New Roman font, 12-point type, double space everything. Do not use any secondary sources. You're just analyzing this thing yourself. And everybody is doing the citations more or less correctly. Does anybody have any questions or want to go over again how to properly cite your primary source?
I was citing like my in-text citations of like the quotes. I used Lord's, Audre Lorde's. Am I supposed to be doing Lord page number, or am I supposed to be adding like the book it's actually coming from as well?
Yeah, just Lord page number in your in-text citations.
And then the works cited I include.
Yeah, and then the works cited, you're citing in the works cited the specific essay rather than the whole book, right?
Okay.
All right, so the paper is going to consist of a 1,500-word argument based on the original close reading of the chosen text. Right? So basic principles here of close reading, right? So you're choosing quotes that you think point to some bigger issue or idea in the text and that add up to a pattern, right? So your exploratory reflection has shown me one piece of the pattern that you've already identified, right? For the paper, what you're going to be doing is showing me more of that pattern and trying to, make some sort of argument as to why it matters. Right, what's this doing? Why does it matter? So you're starting with close attention to particular words and sentences, right? So you're paying attention to denotation and connotation. You're paying attention to ambiguity, right? Multiple possible meanings of specific words. You're looking for potentially meaningful images and symbols. Right? You are looking for patterns and connections, right? Binaries, words or images that repeat, the relationship between speaker and audience, right? All those kinds of things. And then you're going to put that pattern together, right? How do the details you've noticed add up to a singular theme? How can we resolve the meanings of ambiguous words? How does the way the text is put together help us to make meaning? Like, how does this particular pattern help us to get some kind of meaning out of this text, right? And the other thing that you're going to want to make sure you do, right, select some kind of interpretive context for your chosen text, right? So this is usually what we're doing at the beginning of class, right? Where I tell you a little bit about history or philosophy or something like that, and then we read the text in light of that. So yeah, you want to make sure that you are choosing an appropriate interpretive context that helps you situate the text historically or culturally. And the most important part of this last section here that I really, really want to focus on is the avoidance of vague phrases like back in the day and in today's society, right? Please, please, no back in the days, no in today's societies. That makes me want to set myself on fire.
Oh, God.
Right? Make
I
sure.
almost did that with my last one, and then I was like, oh God, it's gonna help me.
Don't do that. You mean you almost used that phrase?
Something along those
Okay,
lines,
okay,
like generic towards
Yes.
the time period. And I was like, oh shit.
And then
Don't
you
do that.
and then you remembered, oh right, that enrages him, don't do that.
Yeah.
Yes, okay. Okay, good. I'm having an effect on you. All right, so the draft is going to be due on Thursday, right? So it's going to be due after we've had our individual conferences. In fact, that's what we'll be talking about in the individual conferences, right? We'll talk about your draft and, maybe a little bit in general about, how things are going for you in the class, that sort of thing, as much as we can cover in 15 minutes. The final paper will be due on the 23rd, so after we come back from the break, right? So you'll have the whole break to finish it, but remember too that by the time you leave, you will already have a significant amount of this work done. So does anybody have any questions about any of this?
Okay, so during the spring break, that's really, because we have like most of it done, it's really just like revising and like rewriting?
Yeah, at that point it is, it's revising according to the comments I've given you, and you'll maybe have another 250 to 500 words to add, right? But yeah, you'll already have most of the work done by the time you leave, I expect. So. Yes. Oh no, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Mine is not even publishing, but.
Oh, okay.
Is this like our midterm, or do we have like a standardized multiple question midterm?
No, I don't think tests tell me anything about what you can do in a composition class.
I agree.
So we don't, we don't do tests. All you're graded on is your written work in this
Okay.
class. So what you're going to be graded on for midterm is everything up to and including the draft, right? The final paper, I'm giving you a little bit of extra time to finish that, so I won't have time to include that in your midterm grade.
Okay.
But everything up to then will be. Yes?
Okay, my question, is that the Hulk on your map?
Pardon?
Is that the Hulk on your map?
No, this is not the Hulk. This is the Irish poet William Butler Yeats.
No. Same thing.
Totally the same thing. Yes, 100%. No. But I guess the way he stretches out across my face maybe looks a little bit like Mark Ruffalo as Bruce Banner. Yeah, not the Hulk. Okay. So I do want to draw everybody's attention briefly to the grading rubric on the last page as well, right? Just so everybody understands exactly what the standards are here. So in order to get the minimum passing grade, a 60, right, the paper has to be long enough, formatted properly, and must not be plagiarized, right? That is the minimum passing standard. A C paper will do all of that, but will also actually address the assignment. Will demonstrate that you understand on a literal level your primary source. You will properly cite that source, and you will advance a clear thesis. A B paper, in addition to all of that, will have a clear, consistent, and effectively arranged argument. We'll actually talk a little bit about how to use your thesis and the development of that thesis as a means of arranging the paper today. You're going to quote your primary source directly. You will not treat opinion as fact, and you will transition clearly between and effectively between paragraphs. Right? So you will demonstrate. You will start each paragraph with a clear topic sentence that explains how the point you're about to make is related to the last point you made. Right? In an A paper, you will give me an original and nuanced argument. Right? So in general, it's better to go with something a little bit daring that goes out on a limb a little bit than it is to stick to something safe, right? So even if something sounds a little crazy, If you can support it with evidence, go with it, right? An A paper also effectively deals with evidence that contradicts or complicates the argument. It's well balanced between argument and evidence. Your argument is properly contextualized and free of glaring historical errors. By glaring historical errors, I mean like not just like getting a date wrong and maybe transposing numbers or something, but like something like saying like George Washington came over on the Mayflower or something like that. That's pretty clearly wrong and untrue, right?
Right.
And it will also follow a single line of argument to its conclusion without digressions, right? So an A paper is going to be a coherent paper, right? One in which you don't, veer off on any weird side paths about connecting them to the main road. Now, a couple of other things I do want to note here about things like paragraph structure, right? Right. So, as I said, you're going to want to start each paragraph with a topic sentence. Right, so a topic sentence is kind of like a mini thesis for the paragraph. Right, you're explaining what the main idea of this paragraph is and how it follows from what you did in the last paragraph, right? You are going to advance a claim within each paragraph. You should deal in each paragraph with only one piece of evidence, and you are going to provide a warrant that connects the evidence to the claim you're making about it, right? You're going to explain why you're justified in making this claim about this piece of evidence, right? What that logical connection is. Do not begin or end your paragraph with a quote. You should always start and finish with your own language. Anybody have any questions about this? Yes?
So do we need to put a counter argument in there, or just continue to argue it throughout put your point across throughout the paper?
I would say, as you are writing, you are probably going to come across evidence that in some way contradicts or complicates your thesis, right? So what we're going to end up doing, this is actually kind of a good way to lead into our main topic for today, right? It's probably a good idea if you think about your whole paper as being shaped kind of like a funnel, right? This does address your question. I'm just taking a slightly roundabout way to do it. So you're going to start with a fairly broad working thesis, and in each paragraph, you are going to apply a new piece of evidence to that thesis to test it. Now, what this means is that in each subsequent paragraph, you're probably going to end up revising your thesis a little bit to account for this other evidence, right? And by the end, in your conclusion, you will end up with a more specific, narrowly qualified version of your original thesis. Right? So it's not something that's going to be completely different from your original idea, but it's an idea that is going to have been tested against all of the evidence, right? That is going to be narrowed and refined through looking at the whole picture. So to give you an example of how this works, right? What I'm asking you to do. How many of you are familiar with the movie Titanic? Okay. The reason I choose this example is because it's a movie that for some reason, even some 20 years on, everybody has seen, right? So I actually personally dislike Titanic a great deal for a variety of reasons, but that's neither here nor there, right? The fact that I don't like it doesn't mean that I can't come up with an interpretation of it. So what's the movie about? What's Titanic about?
Kind of a love story, but also about tragedy and
Yeah.
death and
Okay. Yeah.
failed ship.
Love in the face of a horrible tragedy caused by oversights in shipbuilding, right, and navigation. What's that?
I mean, it was caused by an iceberg.
Yeah. So, when you're thinking about, say, writing a love story that you're setting in this particular historical moment, right? Then, of course, you have to take into account that this is probably going to be tragic in some way, right? Because the whole event is tragic, right? So if everybody knows the boat sinks, right? This is not a surprise to anyone.
You just spoiled it.
So let's talk about this, because what the movie is really about is not something like the boat sinking is really just a backdrop to something else, right? It's not what the movie's really about. So what's the movie really about? What's the real center of the movie?
There's like a conflict between Rose's life. I mean, she's got this life set out for her from her parents and her mom, that she needs to be like this elegant and marry this asshole dude that has money, but that's not what she wants. She wants Jack, who's crazy and not as rich as the other guy. I don't know, she wants to live, not exist.
Okay. If we had to rate Rose's social status, where would we place her?
Up high.
Yeah.
Upper class.
Yeah. She's of high social status. She's engaged to a real turd, as you said. And her control over her choices is limited, right? Anything else you want to say about her? Okay. What are you thinking there, Ryan?
I was thinking about the part, like when they're floating on the thing and she didn't let Jack.
Okay.
I just thought they could have took turns, but that's just me.
We'll get to that, right? Okay, well, let's think about the other character, Jack. Right? What's Jack like as opposed to Rose?
Lower class.
Okay, yeah, lower class, right? To the extent that he has an occupation, what is he?
I don't know what he is, I forget.
I have not watched the movie in forever.
I actually just watched this movie.
Uh-huh.
Like not that long ago.
He's an artist, right? But
Oh, yeah,
there's
yeah.
not much sense that he makes much money from
Right.
it. He's, also, kind of like a gambler and a drifter.
Uh-huh.
What else can we say about Jack, particularly if we're comparing the things we've already said about Rose?
He's trying to think of the word.
He's more
Not
free.
elegant.
Okay, free-spirited, maybe, yeah, okay.
Something like that. Well, like versus how she has the control of limited life, he's able to do what he wants, in a sense. Yeah, no responsibilities. That was the word. It's crazy.
And, as Ryland has noted for us, right? This may not be so important in our initial reading, but I think it's going to be important as to how we interpret this in the end, right? Rose lives, Jack dies. So if we look at these two characters, right, if we take these two personalities as a starting point for our analysis, right, how likely does it look that these two would meet and form a relationship on land?
Never.
Probably not very, right? So the constrained nature of life on a ship, right, the kind of artificially limited parameters of being on a boat together, right, seems to allow for some level of cross-class contact here, right, that we wouldn't maybe normally see in an ordinary city. So my first working thesis here is going to be, right, in Titanic, the ship creates an enclosed world in which normal restrictions on class mixing are suspended, and cross-class relationships are possible. Now, before I go any further with this, I want to see if it meets the basic thesis test, right? So a thesis needs to be arguable in two senses, right? It must be arguable in that, one, it must be supported by evidence, and two, it must be possible for others looking at the same evidence to disagree. And I find that, at least on first glance here, the evidence that I have here in front of me, yeah, this seems to be supportable, right? And yeah, someone else looking at the same evidence maybe could come to a different conclusion, right? So it seems to pass the arguable test here. In addition, your thesis must be sufficiently complex. Right, that is, it should place two ideas in tension with each other. So think about like that seems to be about X, but could also be about Y kind of situation, right? So this seems to be about love, but is really about social class here, right? Is kind of where this is trending. So yeah, I think this passes that second test as well. Now let's think about some of the other elements of the film that we could throw in here, and we'll see whether this original thesis stands up. Do Jack and Rose meet and fall in love through the normal course of interactions on the ship? Do they just bump into each other and their eyes lock and violins play?
He sees her. He's like, she was reading, I think.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and then she was super like standoffish towards him
Yeah.
at first, and he was just very persistent.
Well, how is it that he actually gets into her good graces?
He saved her from killing herself.
Yeah, he stops her from jumping off the ship, right?
Yeah.
So they are both someplace they're not supposed to be at that time, right? Someplace where passengers aren't supposed to go. So we see that they only actually meet and get together when they're both violating the rules.
I think that just moving on with your thesis about how the no restrictions and
Uh-huh.
the suspended class, which, like, it's possible. It was possible because they broke the rules.
Yeah, it's
And
only,
But there's really,
yeah.
the ship just, I guess it symbolizes no rules, I guess, in a way, but no restrictions.
Uh-huh. But there is a restriction, right? Passengers aren't supposed to go there,
Yeah.
and they break the restriction, right? So if they're actually following the normal rules, even of the ship, they still shouldn't be mixing or interacting, right? So we can use this to then rethink our original idea a little bit, right? While it may appear the class structures are ignored or suspended aboard Titanic, passengers only come into contact with other social classes by breaking the ship's rules. And then once that initial contact is established through this rule breaking, right? How well does it work out for either of these characters? When Jack is invited by Rose's family to have dinner with them, how do they treat him?
He's gone.
Yeah, they treat him with contempt, right? So he's still treated with contempt. By the wealthy passengers, right? And when Rose goes below decks with Jack to where the poor are, or the working classes, how well does she fit in down there?
She had a blast.
She has a blast, right? And they're nice to her.
Yeah.
But it's also clearly not her
Yeah,
words,
she
right?
is very new to her.
Yeah. She gets drunk, she gets a little too excited, right? So she has fun below decks, but doesn't really fit in. Or doesn't really know how to conduct herself, right? So what we're seeing here is that these worlds actually are still kept pretty separate on the ship, right? And if we think to the end of the film, we can take this even further, right? First off, when we look at who lives and who dies, right? Rich girl lives, poor boy dies. No matter how much room there was on that door, right? Not to mention there was also plenty of other floating debris all over the place, right? Another thing we might note along these same lines is that we see in like the final hour of the movie plenty of instances of rich people behaving heroically, right? There's the rich woman from Colorado who organizes the passengers and gets people to safety and all that. You've got those rich old white guys who decide to just give up their places in the boats and go and have a cigar and go down with the ship, right, while the band plays them out. Meanwhile, you have poor passengers at the gates being locked in by the crew and shouting to be let out, right? And you have that other scene, the Irish immigrant mother putting her children to bed and singing them a lullaby, knowing that none of them are going to wake up, right? Which, that particular moment in the film, I remember when I saw this when I was in college, had me spitting with rage. Lots of things get me spinning with rage, but I digress.
Really?
Yeah. You sound surprised, yeah. So, what do we do with all of this then in light of our original idea? Well, it looks kind of like what's going on here is that the film ultimately values the lives of rich people more than the lives of poor people. Right? Even the rich people who allow themselves to die typically do so fairly heroically, right? In ways that are admirable. Whereas, what happens to the poor people below decks is certainly unfair. We also see them kind of railing against their fate, right? So, that coupled with the fact that Rose doesn't share the damn door, suggests that the movie, in the end, really kind of simply reinforces existing class structures, right? So, while it may appear that Titanic critiques rigid social hierarchies in its tale of cross-class romance, in the end, the movie seems to value the rich more than it values the poor. So you see how we've kind of taken an original broad thesis, right, and developed it and narrowed it and made it more specific through the application of evidence, right? And this is what you should be doing in your papers, right? You start with a broad idea that you think accounts for as much of the evidence as you have, and then in each subsequent paragraph, you test it against a new piece of evidence, right? And you revise your thesis into something more refined and more specific until you get to something that you think accounts for everything, right? And that's the basic shape of your paper. That's your basic paper funnel, right? So does everybody understand what we did here, more or less?
Yes, and like to keep it arguable and not to like, treat your opinion as fact, because what we do is we basically do our opinions. But like, using words like seems to value and may appear, like that's what keeps it arguable. Right? That is one way to hedge. Is never use the word never, and never use the word absolutely. Right? Or obviously. For one thing, if it's obvious, there's no need to point it out, right? But yeah, absolutely and never. You do kind of want to steer clear of extremes, right? And you want to make clear that what you're offering is, it's not so much it's not an opinion necessarily, it's an interpretation, right? That what you are offering is an interpretation. And, using words like may appear and seems also bears in mind that these are things that may not be part of the filmmaker's intent, right? They may not have meant to do this. That doesn't mean the film can't be read in this way, right?
So you're not bashing them, you're just saying this is how I interpret it.
Yeah, this is just my interpretation of what happens in the film, yeah.
But I do have another, so like at the end of each of those like paragraphs, like when we change the topic, do we just need to go into like a transition to the next, like would we put the thesis like on the top, like something like that on the top, or would that be like the end?
So I think you probably want to end the paragraphs with something like this, right? So just as you end your first paragraph with your original thesis statement, right? That's the usual place you want to put your first statement of thesis, right? this is probably what you're going to end up with at the end of each paragraph, right? After you have looked at and tested the piece of evidence, right?
Alright, okay.
Any other questions about this? Okay, so what I'd like to do now then is talk a little bit about how to recognize and fix particular types of weak thesis statement, right? So, if you, so you know when you do this, you recognize it and you can do something about it, right? So the first example I'm going to give you is one of the most common, or at least it's one of the ones that I run across most commonly. So I'm going to write something on the board, and you are going to tell me what's wrong with it. In this paper, I intend to analyze Audre Lorde's definition of silence.
Literally wrote that.
I'm about to say, I put a little fact over here.
Okay. Shit.
It's not meant to be an attack on anyone.
No.
But why is this problematic if this is your thesis statement?
But we're not supposed to blatantly tell you what we're writing about. That's what the reader is supposed to figure out.
Well, no, I mean, I do want you to be clear to me about what it is you're writing about, right?
Right.
Is it clear to me from this what you are trying to argue?
No. I
Yeah.
intend to analyze,
Yeah.
there's definitely a better way to say that.
Well, and does this make any real argument or claim?
No. It's just telling
Yeah. That's the problem, right? This is the thing I'm going to do, but I'm not going to tell you exactly what my point is, right? So this is what we call the no claim thesis. Right? Remember that a thesis has to make a claim, right? So you fix this two ways, right? First, you raise a specific issue to discuss. So we've already got a notion. So if we want to analyze her definition of silence, then we must already think that her definition of silence is itself in some way arguable or unconventional, right? So we want to think about what we think she's actually doing with silence in the piece. And then we want to make sure that we stake out a clear position. So we might revise this to something like, well, Audre Lorde sees speaking out as a way of making ourselves vulnerable. She also argues that silence makes us even more vulnerable in that it robs us of the chance to form communities. So now I'm saying something specific about what she does with silence in the essay, and why I think that's particularly meaningful, right? Now, you may not go in the same direction with this, right? You may interpret the idea of silence differently. But the difference here is that I'm offering an interpretation of it where before I wasn't, right? I was just saying, this is what I'm going to look at. I wasn't telling you what I actually think about it or what I want to argue about it. And that's the really important thing, right? Is to make sure that you are making an argument. Okay. Second example.
I guess like saying that doesn't really prove that you know what the paper's about or know what your reading's about. Like you're going to analyze it for the first time.
Yeah.
Instead of reacting to it.
There is no reaction here, right? This is just basic statement of purpose, right? Yeah, I want to know not just what you want to look at, right, but I want to know what you think about it. All right, second example. You are going to find that this is, in some ways a little bit related. Rock music is primarily derived from black musical forms like the blues. What's wrong with this as a thesis?
I feel like that's not arguable.
Yeah, why?
It's just a fact.
That's exactly the problem here, right?
Yeah.
Is that, this is just, yeah, you understand perfectly what the problem here is, yes.
Okay.
This is just a statement of fact. And facts are not really subject to argument, right? So what we have to do then to fix this is raise some question or issue within the facts, right? So I might want to think about the relation, the specific relationship between rock and the blues, right? Or between musicians working in both of these forms, right? One thing that I might come to is, something like the ethics of this derivation, and how that worked out historically. So when I think about, say, artists, like Led Zeppelin performing old standards written by bluesmen, and then claiming that Jimmy Page and Robert Plant wrote them, and not paying royalties to those bluesmen, right? That gets me thinking a little bit about this broader history. And I can come up with a thesis by thinking along those lines, right? So, when white musicians adapted black musical forms in the 1950s and 1960s, it broke social taboos, right? It did. But also enriched white artists and managers at the expense of the black artists who had originated the style. So what I've done here is found a kind of complicating narrative within this fact, right? That this basic fact doesn't fully explain the relationship between these musical styles or the musicians who worked in them, right? So looking for the complexity or arguable points within a fact, right, is a good way to derive a thesis from it. Does everybody understand me so far? Everybody following?
Yes.
Okay, good. So let me give you a third example. And this one is going to involve a phrase that always makes me puke in my mouth a little bit. I'm sure all of you had to read Romeo and Juliet in high school, right?
And in college.
Okay, so you've done it twice.
Why did like the off, like the cheat, like I had to watch and read the cheesy off, like Romeo in Love or whatever, or Shakespeare.
Shakespeare in Love. Okay, yeah, it's with who's the Joseph Fiennes and
Yeah.
Gwyneth Paltrow. You know, before you say that, like, you know, Tom Stoppard, who wrote the screenplay, is a hell of a good playwright, and will not hear a word against him.
I'm sorry, but I did not like that.
I would argue that movie is actually better than Romeo and Juliet is as a play. So Romeo and Juliet's willingness to die for each other. Yeah, we're getting into heavy territory here. Shows that love conquers all, even death. All right, so what's the barf-inducing phrase here?
Love conquers all.
Okay, yeah, and why is it barf-inducing? Why do we consider this immediately suspect?
Because it's
Yeah.
not,
Shit, I mean.
It's a cliche, right? So what's a cliche? When we say something is cliched, what do we mean?
It's just like very commonly used, very trite context.
Yes, trite, commonplace, overused, and basically meaningless, right? Cliches are these conversational formulas that we rely on when we don't really have any thoughts of our own, right? Or when we are pressed for time, it's the night before the paper is due and we have to come up with something. So this is another argument against, waiting too long to get your work done, right? But the basic problem with a cliche is that, like, it's just, it's one of these phrases that you hear over and over and over again that doesn't really mean anything. So what you want to try to do when you find yourself writing a cliche, right, is look at the cliche closely and question the terms, right? Do they really fit the thing that you're looking at? How well do they actually describe the thing you're trying to examine? And how might we instead subvert the whole idea, right? Try to turn the whole thing on its head. So if we think about a play like Romeo and Juliet, right? What actually happens in that play?
miscommunication.
Okay, yeah, horrible, tragic miscommunication, right? But yeah, let's just kind of break this down to the literal level, right? What happens at the end of the play?
They both die.
They both die, right?
Stupid death.
Yes, because Juliet has taken this potion, right, to make her appear to be dead. Romeo thinks she's actually dead and kills himself. She wakes up, sees him dead, kisses him, and kills herself, right?
Doesn't she kill it with the same dagger that he used?
Yeah. So there's probably some kind of weird psychosexual argument you could make about something like that, right? But another thing that we have to remember here, right, is that, in the world of this play, Romeo and Juliet they're like 14, right? They're kids. And what do we know about kids?
We don't know nothing about love.
Or anything, right?
Nothing.
how, you know, you're maybe not as far from it as I am, but it's like, did you make good decisions when you were 14?
All right.
Most people make terrible hormone-induced decisions when they are 14, right? So, if we actually look at the events of the play, right, what we can see is that, you know, while Romeo and Juliet may appear to celebrate the intensity of young love, in fact, love makes the protagonists foolish, impulsive, and self-destructive. So when you find yourself writing a cliche, right, looking more closely at the facts you're writing about should lead you to question the cliche and come up with something better, right? So one more example here. And in fact, I'm not even going to give you a specific example. I'm just going to give you a kind of generalized form that this sort of thing usually takes.
Our own personal religious belief or political?
Yeah. So, what I'm trying to tell you not to do here, right,
Is that?
is exactly that, right? Don't over-personalize
Right.
the things that you're trying to read, right? You're trying to interpret. If you are trying to look at it only through the lens of your own experience, you're probably going to get it wrong. So this is why it's really important to set a clear and appropriate interpretive context. Now, I don't want anyone to take this to mean that I don't think you can have religious beliefs or personal political convictions, right? Of course you do. Everyone does, right? Even non-belief is a form of belief, right? What I am saying is that you need to try to understand the text that you're trying to interpret on their own terms, right? Not in terms of your own personal experience. I will just for a moment take us back to the story I told at the beginning of the semester, right, where those two guys pulled up at me in their truck. And because of my limited experience of life in a small southern town, I thought they were going to shoot me, right? Because my impression of small southern towns came largely from movies and TV, which had led me astray, right? And I wasn't accustomed, having spent, most of my adult life in northeastern cities, to strangers coming up to me on the street and knowing what kind of car I drove, right? So try not to interpret things solely through the lens of your own experience, right? Try to understand them on their own terms, and that will get you further. So does anybody have any questions about any of this?
I do have a question, not about this, but about...
Yeah.
So I was thinking about how you said, like, setting up our paragraphs, each paragraph to have like, one, like, strong evidence
Yes.
to go with your claim and then a warrant for that.
Uh-huh.
In terms of evidence, does that have to be a quotation from the piece? Or can I use something an idea she had as evidence?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be a direct quote from the piece,
Okay.
right? One thing I will say, generally speaking, in the humanities, the norm is to quote rather than to summarize or paraphrase. But if you are referencing something that is an idea
Yeah, 'cause sometimes
that is
it's
associated
easier
with
to
her
just
work,
do it
yeah.
myself than quote her directly.
Yeah, if you're paraphrasing or summarizing her, you would still have to cite it. But if you're not, if you're just putting something
Right.
like from class discussion into your own words, you don't have to cite that. And yeah, and that can still be a piece of evidence, yes.
So also, what about like with the, like even with the assignment that we have, like use them from our reflection one,
Uh-huh.
do we have to quote since it's from a different piece, even though it's from our, like us?
Do you have to quote yourself, do you mean?
Yeah, do we have to quote ourselves?
No. You're going to work quotes from Audre Lorde's. I think you were writing about Audre Lorde, right?
Mhm.
So you'll work quotes from Audre Lorde's piece into the body of your paper, but you don't have to quote your own work, right?
Right. Okay, because I was getting confused. I was wondering about that.
Yeah, you're not quoting yourself. You're actually revising yourself, right? You're revising yourself and then building on what you've already written. So.
Oh.
And in general, you only need to cite work that's been published.
Yeah,
Okay, any other questions? Okay, so with the last 15 minutes, what I want to do then is revisit what we were working on last time and try to do like similar kind of work to what we did with the Titanic example here with your stuff. So, can somebody remind me what the what the best claims we came up with, or what we came up with were? What we ended class with.
Where mine was, my second claim, the need to drive everywhere is a direct result of suburban development.
Okay. Good. And Grace, what was yours?
Basically the same thing, just reworded.
Okay.
Literally, the production of cars changed the development of suburban neighborhoods.
Okay, great. So what I would like you guys to do now, right, is first go through the list and cite all of the pieces of evidence that you think already support this directly. And then think about how they support this directly, right?
So this is a claim.
This is a claim, yep. the trolleys here?
Oh my god, I hate that thing.
What have you got against the America's trolley?
They have a trolley.
It's about the only meaningful public transportation we have in Americas.
Oh,
It was like 4 miles an hour, and I'm just like,
but they go walk that way.
I'm going to take a second and teach you guys two acronyms that relate to this stuff. NIMBY stands for Not in My Backyard. And banana stands for build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. So the banana is the more extreme form of the NIMBY.
yeah.
Okay, so what have you got? So what are some of the points of evidence here that are directly support this claim?
Like I said, I numbered them. So the number 6 on the first, American neighborhoods developed after 1950 rarely got sidewalks.
Okay.
And so less sidewalks, less walking.
Yeah.
Some people have to drive.
Mhm.
Also, number 4, I mean, it kind of goes with the same thing. While older American towns and cities are set up according to grid patterns, which I guess would have sidewalks,
Mhm.
in which multiple
Typically.
walking or driving routes can be used to reach the same destination in the same amount of time. Newer cities and suburbs tend to be designed as cul-de-sacs that empty out onto a single feeder road. You can't really walk, cul-de-sacs. You have to
Yeah,
drive.
yeah. Does everybody understand, by the way, what cul-de-sac development looks like?
Yes.
Yeah, that's circle with streets with houses, and then there are 1 or 2 roads that come in and out of it, right?
Yeah.
So you basically can't enter it without a car, and there are choke points to keep, that essentially create more traffic, right?
Right.
Okay, good. What else?
I put in the average New American home, the garage is as large as the living space.
Okay, so let's think about the implications of that there too, right? What does that say? If people are building bigger garages, what does that mean?
People have more cars.
More cars, yes, people have more cars. Good, what else?
Suburban neighborhoods rarely offer public transportation because everyone's got their own car.
Uh-huh. So I think we're seeing another strand develop here, right, as we look through this, right? One that's related not just to cars, but also to privacy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why would you design a neighborhood like this rather than like a grid?
Because they want a close-knit kind of like neighborhood. They don't want it to be so big.
Yeah, and
Open. I mean, from a cul-de-sac, no one can come in from the other side. You can only come in through the front of the neighborhood.
yeah,
And they could have gates and stuff too.
Uh-huh.
To where to protect it, to be like a private neighborhood, so there's not. so
Exactly.
many break-ins
Mhm.
and whatnot, depending on the situation.
Even just cutting through. I know.
Yeah,
If I go through a neighborhood to cut through and there's a cul-de-sac, I get pissed off. I'm like, damn.
uh-huh, yeah, because you're just going to get stuck. Yeah, you're going to end
It's
up.
like a dead end.
Yeah, you're going to end up walking
Right.
further than you.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, my in-laws live in a neighborhood like this. They live 15 miles from Center City, Philly. But it will take you an hour and a half to get anywhere interesting from where they live. It's just because of the way the streets are designed and because of traffic, right? But I think, think about this in terms of cars and public transit as well, right? So who gets to use public transit?
Everyone.
Everybody, right? At least theoretically, right? Anybody can get on the bus or get on the train, right? Who gets to use your private car?
You.
You do, right?
Whoever has the
And
keys.
whoever has the keys, right? Which we think is presumably you, right? But may very well not be, right? So we're also seeing here a trend related to privacy, right? That the need to drive everywhere is a direct result of suburban development, and that suburban development itself seems to be in some way arising from a desire for increased privacy, right? If we look at this last point as well, right? This is specifically related to the NIMBY banana thing, right? People in suburban neighborhoods often oppose the building of new housing units, schools, hospitals, or retail centers near their homes, right? Now, housing units, schools, hospitals, retail centers, are these things that we think of as bad?
No, but it is bad in terms of bringing more people in and traffic and stuff.
Yeah, if what you want is for your neighborhood to remain private, you don't want stuff being built in or near it, right? But then paradoxically, what does all of this need for privacy end up doing? If we think about the fact that, homes now have bigger garages for more cars, you can't get anywhere from a neighborhood like this without a car. In fact, one of the reasons people often oppose this new construction, particularly things like schools and hospitals, is that they increase traffic, right? So what does this desire for increased privacy end up creating more of?
Silence.
Well, there's a specific problem that it ends up creating more of.
Isolation.
Okay, yeah, isolation. And also, you're going to spend more time sitting in traffic, right?
More driving.
What's that?
Is it more driving than you like?
Yeah, more driving, more traffic, right? If everybody has to drive,
What's bad for the environment?
yeah, it is all. Yeah, that is also true. But yeah, the basic idea that I'm getting at here is there is a tension here between people's need for privacy, right, and people's desire to get where they want to go in a timely fashion, right? So we can probably we can revise this thesis in a way that reflects that, right? That while suburban developments, while car-driven suburban development arises in part out of a desire for privacy, it means more time spent sitting alone in your car. Reducing time for meaningful interaction or something of that nature, right? So I'm just kind of spitballing here. This probably isn't the final form of this that I would rest on, but we're about out of time here. So we're going to end with that because we started a little early. Does anybody have any questions about anything? All right, so remember that for next time, we're not coming here, right? Next time, come to the computer lab downstairs. I promise it will be obvious where it is.
We go through the